From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
As the polls for Joe Biden somehow managed to get even worse, the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee introduces the nation to J.D. Vance, the next potential vice president of the United States, as well as his wife, while the delegates now await tonight's highly anticipated speech by the man himself, Donald Trump. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues in Milwaukee, columnists James Freeman and Kim Strassel. James, we'll give you the first word since Kim and I have been yakking on here all week, but your Best of the Web column on Wednesday at WSJ.com ran under the headline, "It's official, Republicans are staging an effective convention." So perhaps the place to start would be, what did you mean by that? And what has been your overall impression so far of these proceedings, the delegates, the swag, the beer cheese soup, or anything else that has caught your eye this week?
Yeah, it's a pretty happy gathering. As far as the headline, that was driving back, listening to the radio to NBC along with our colleague, the inimitable James Toronto, the other night. And for what has become for Republicans kind of the acid test of whether their communications efforts are working is how sad the panelists at MSNBC are reacting to it. And by that yardstick, this seems to have been a strong convention. And that's my judgment as well. I think it's been compelling, effective. That was specifically talking about the Laura Trump speech, where I think she made a pretty good case for her father-in-law. And I think about each night of the convention, I think it's been a well-produced, well-staged pitch for a second Trump administration.
The headliner was the vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, the first-term senator from Ohio, introduced by his wife, Usha. And it seems to me, Kim, that they made a relatively good first political impression on a country that probably still doesn't know much about them unless you happen to be a voter in the state of Ohio who watched that 2022 Senate race. And in my view, Vance was most effective in talking about his biography, the subject of the famous memoir that brought him to prominence, Hillbilly Elegy, published in 2016. Let's listen to a piece of Vance talking about growing up.
Despite the closing factories and the growing addiction in towns like mine, in my life, I had a guardian angel by my side. She was an old woman who could barely walk, but she was tough as nails. I called her Mamaw, the name we hillbillies gave to our grandmothers. Mamaw raised me as my mother struggled with addiction. Mamaw was in so many ways a woman of contradiction. She loved the Lord, ladies and gentlemen. She was a woman of very deep Christian faith. But she also loved the F word. I'm not kidding. She could make a sailor blush. Now, she once told me, when she found out that I was spending too much time with a local kid who was known for dealing drugs, that if I ever hung out with that kid again, she would run him over with her car. That's true. And she said, "JD, no one will ever find out about it."
Kim's good laughs there, and not the strained laughter that you often hear during these speeches when a politician makes kind of a corny joke. And one thing that I think will go down of this speech is then the audience chanting, "Mamaw, Mamaw, Mamaw." That is a great moment in American political history. But what did you make, Kim, of J.D. and Usha Vance?
Well, first a word for his wife, Usha Vance. And I think she undoubtedly charmed the audience out there. And one of the things that made her charming was that she looked really nervous up there on the stage. And we have this sometimes where you've got political couples, and one of them is not necessarily hugely engaged in politics. And, to suddenly be put in front of the entire nation and have to talk, you could see that on her face, a little bit of hesitation. But she did it in such a wonderful and genuine way that I have no doubt that everyone on the floor really loved it. And of course, what she did was set up the theme that you mentioned, Kyle, which was, let me introduce you to my husband and let's talk about his biography. And J.D. Vance, in a way, really needed to do that in this speech, because while his name is something that you hear a lot, he has not been on the political scene a long time. He's been in elected office for about 18 months. So people might have heard about the race he ran in Ohio, or they might have heard about a policy thing here or there, certainly heard his name now as the Veep choice. But what about his history? And for anyone who hasn't read Hillbilly Elegy, and there probably are a lot of people who have not read Hillbilly Elegy, he has a really impressive story. He came up from pretty much nothing, a very troubled household and community. You heard that there. His parents had a lot of problems. He was essentially raised by his grandparents. He managed to triumph over all of this, ended up ultimately going into U.S. service and then to Yale Law School. And I think the tributes he gave to his grandmother, also he gave a shout out to his mom, who, we know from his book, had an addiction problem. He actually said on the stage 10 years clean and suggested that maybe if Trump was up for it, they could, have a celebration party for her in the White House. So I think all of that played very, very well. He looked genuine, which was important, but more importantly, he gave a story of a life that I think a lot of Americans can identify with and resonate with, given the sweeping problems we have these days of unemployment and addiction. And that was central to his introduction to the country.
Many people, it seems, are now picking up Hillbilly Elegy who didn't read it when it came out in 2016, despite that it was a bestseller at the time. This is the headline a couple days ago from the Journal's news blog on the Milwaukee convention. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy is #1 on Amazon's best-selling list. But James, I want to highlight another piece of the speech by J.D. Vance. This was not a policy speech. This was an introduction for him to the country, to voters outside of Ohio. But he did touch on a couple of policy points, and there I have to raise a little bit of a skeptical eyebrow. Here is where he is talking about Nafta, the North American Free Trade Agreement, to boos from the audience.
When I was in the 4th grade, a career politician by the name of Joe Biden supported Nafta, a bad trade deal that sent countless good jobs to Mexico. When I was a sophomore in high school, that same career politician named Joe Biden gave China a sweetheart trade deal that destroyed even more good American middle-class manufacturing jobs. When I was a senior in high school, that same Joe Biden supported the disastrous invasion of Iraq, and at each step of the way, in small towns like mine in Ohio or next door in Pennsylvania or Michigan, in states all across our country, jobs were sent overseas and our children were sent to war.
And here's J.D. Vance talking about what he sees as the cause of the high price of housing in the United States.
The absurd cost of housing is the result of so many failures, and it reveals so much about what's broken in Washington. I can tell you exactly how it happened. Wall Street barons crashed the economy and American builders went out of business. As tradesmen scrambled for jobs, houses stopped being built. The lack of good jobs, of course, led to stagnant wages. And then the Democrats flooded this country with millions of illegal aliens. So citizens had to compete with people who shouldn't even be here for precious housing.
James, I grant that the vice president is not in charge of policy. So J.D. Vance's instincts on these questions are perhaps less important than the guy at the top of the ticket. But I would like to run these arguments by a few economists. These are not the economically traditional and I think traditionally conservative Republican views of trade and of what's gone wrong in the housing markets.
No, I think the argument that housing is expensive and that the last financial crisis occurred because of government action is a good one, but I would disagree with them on the precise causes. I think Washington's mania for making homes affordable, in quotes, is what had done so much damage to that market. Before the financial crisis, so many incentives to invest in that one asset class, easy money from the Fed. We could go on about mistakes regulating large financial institutions.
Fannie Mae?
Yeah, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, giving much of the financial industry huge incentives to put capital into that one specific place in the economy. And then you get into credit ratings agencies given more or less official power by the government. And so when they were assuring investors that mortgage-backed securities were safe, that essentially had almost the force of law. So we can go into all of the governmental mistakes that created the last housing crisis. As far as since then, why is housing expensive now? inflation created in Washington is a big part of it. That forced the Federal Reserve finally to start raising interest rates. Obviously, that makes it difficult since most people buy with 30-year mortgages. So those rates have come up a lot. Trade, the problem I think that Trump started to address in his first administration is it is hard for the worker to compete internationally if we have a highly regulated, highly taxed domestic economy. And I think what you're not hearing this week, and it's partly a leap of faith for Republicans, is that side of the Trump agenda. He was very successful as a deregulator and as a tax reformer in his first term. And I think it's kind of the often unstated hope here that we're going to see that as well in the second term, and that's going to offset ideally all of the harm that comes from restricting trade. But it's to this point in the convention, it's got to be kind of a leap of faith. I think part of the issue is the Trump track record for the first term, but also the fact that the Democratic Party led by Joe Biden has really divorced itself. Our colleague Dan Henninger has written about this over the years. It's really divorced itself from the free market. And so now, if you're a small business person, Biden really isn't offering you anything unless you're in some way connected to the solar panel industry or some similarly favored, politically supported enterprise. So that's what I'm hoping to hear more of. What is the case? What is the plan to encourage job creators, entrepreneurs?
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Let's take a letter from a listener. Nick asks, what do you make of Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene and Representative Matt Gaetz, among others, getting speaking roles during the convention? They are two of the troublemakers who have created unhelpful chaos in the House. It seems like the party shouldn't reward bad behavior, and I would argue that Trump doesn't need them as much as they need Trump. Kim, let me throw that to you.
Well, look, I think one of the things that obviously was a priority for Republicans with this convention, and I think James touched on it in the beginning of this podcast, was unity. That was not something that they had back in 2016. Don't forget that there were still Republicans that were staging floor fights and maneuvers to try to deny Trump the nomination, and he didn't really consolidate support until later in the fall. There wasn't a convention to speak of in terms of delegates and everybody being in the same place in 2020. And so, especially given the primary situation that he had challenges from Haley and DeSantis, there was a goal here of doing everything they could to bring that party together. I think it was aided a lot this week by the very scary events of last weekend, which drew a lot of sympathy for Mr. Trump and brought over some people who were hanging out. But this was part of the decision to have different voices up there on the stage. Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, I mean, they were early in the convention speeches. They weren't up there long. For a number of people out there in the audience, there's a certain status around both of them, especially Gaetz, given his role in getting rid of Kevin McCarthy, something that a lot of people thought was a good idea. I disagree with it, given the chaos that came after it. But I will tell you, Kyle, I was down on the floor when Gaetz came out, and a lot of people out there were pretty thrilled to have him. And I think just given the prominence they have right now in Congress, to have denied them speaking slots might have been seen as a snub and caused bruised feelings and made delegates unhappy. And that was just not the scene they were going for in this convention.
James, you mentioned you're hoping to hear more throughout the rest of the convention on revving economic growth. What else are you hoping to hear, and what do you think President Trump should say? We've had this reporting that after the attempt on his life in Pennsylvania, he ripped up his convention speech and he decided it was time to try to unify the country. I think we've seen some of that reflected in the speeches that other people have made that have been perhaps less pointed than they would have been otherwise. But if you were advising President Trump about what he should say tonight, when he has the attention of what will surely be millions of people watching this convention, what would you tell him to do?
Well, I do think that prosperity should be a big part of it. A leader can't really make much of anything great if we have anemic economic growth. So I think that's a big part of it. I think a message of healing, of unity might actually change some minds. We think about people having made up their minds pro or con about Donald Trump a long time ago, and that's probably true for a lot of people. But especially after that awful event of last weekend, I think he does have a moment here where people who who have not considered him previously might see what he has to say. And if it's a speech without sharp partisan edges, he might do himself some good, getting some moderate, upscale suburban voters to give him another look.
Kim, what about you? Is it too much to imagine that President Trump might get on stage and say, listen, I have reflected on the divisiveness of our political rhetoric in the past few years, and I think we should all take the temperature down a few notches, and I will pledge not to prosecute people coming out of the Biden administration if they haven't committed some kind of serious meat and potatoes crime. And I mean, that would be a place to start.
Bear in mind that we often see two Donald Trumps when he's in front of big crowds. One of them is Donald Trump in campaign rally mode, where he tends to speak a lot more off the cuff, and he sometimes gets on a roll and says things that the media then jumps all over. But he can show great discipline, especially when he's addressing a forum on a set piece with a teleprompter, and he knows he's in front of the nation. He's certainly done that a couple of times recently in notable fashion, in particular the debate, in which he really was very much in control and did not go off argument, and obviously decisively won that debate. He's aware that he's in front of the country. I can't speak to how last weekend's events have personally affected him. But I was struck. He recently did this interview with Bloomberg, and he was asked again about the retribution question. And he repeated a good line that he had, which was, my payback is going to be success. My payback is going to be winning, getting into office. Having a line like that tonight, I think, would be really good. Talking a little bit about the terrible problems incumbent with a Department of Justice that is engaged in lawfare and going after opponents. He certainly has been on the receiving end of that, and making clear that he is going to restore the Department of Justice to its actual function, which is prosecuting real crimes and not political ones. I think he could make a lot of headway on that too. And inviting people in, one of the strongest lines, we didn't talk about this, from last night, I thought, was the speech from Don Jr., his son, who finished his speech by saying, hey, folks, if you're looking around and you're concerned about your choice of Joe Biden out there, come on in. We're a party that are about ideas and growth, and we want you here. I think Donald Trump repeating something like that, too, could be very effective at a moment when the electorate is very unsettled, certainly isn't thrilled with the incumbent, might be a little nervous yet about Republicans and their leader, but could be convinced, especially if he extends that invitation.